welcome. As I said, I'm really excited that June has agreed to join us today and share some of her vast knowledge on food. June is a longtime organic gardener and homesteader. She started out on 40 acres in Buckfield and has been preserving food for many, many years. Early on, not having running water or electricity, she relied on methods that included fermentation and canning. Today, June has transitioned to less than 1.5 acres, which she and her late partner, Adam Tomash, call Avant Gardens. She continues to grow and preserve most of her own fruits and vegetables, and today she also relies on freezing, dehydrating, and she's going to talk about all of these methods with us today. Most of you are probably familiar with MOFGA, but if not, we're a broad-based community organization that advocates for and educates about organic farming and gardening. And we have a lot of resources available for gardeners. We have a page on our website called Resources for Gardeners. And another series that we're offering this summer are Q&A sessions with some of our farmer programming staff members. You can check out the MOFGA website if you're interested and you have questions about your garden. And I think that is all the housekeeping I was going to mention. So June, I think you're there. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, I am here, and I will tell people that this is very odd for me, and what I'm seeing is sort of nothing. So I'm assuming that you can see me, and if you can't, you will put that into the chat. Since this is billed as a program for beginning gardeners, I'm coming from the assumption that you are new to this, so the information I'm giving is going to be pretty basic. I'd like to start with 3 questions that I'd like you to be thinking about as I talk about these various methods. And I think the most important question is, what do you or will you actually eat if you preserve it or save it in some way? Nothing is more discouraging to a new gardener than to spend days canning tomatoes and then finding out that one rarely cooks with tomatoes in the winter. So figuring out what you eat is a really important part of making this work for you. The next question to ask yourself is, how much time do you have? Some of these techniques don't take a lot of time. Some of them actually do. So right now, I think many of us have a lot of time on our hand as we're still social distancing, but that's not always going to be the case. And then the third question I'd like you to keep in mind is, how much money do you want to spend on equipment and supplies? Some of these techniques don't really require much of an expenditure at all, and others can be rather expensive. Now I'm going to segue into giving you some general words of advice, which you can certainly take or leave. The first thing I would say would be to start small. Try some things out before you jump in and buy a lot of equipment or do big things. If you know another gardener, maybe you can can together or make jelly together. See what it's like before you go a long way down the road and realize it's not something you're going to want to do. Keep records. I think this is actually the most important part of gardening, and many people don't like to do it. I know exactly how many plants I start in the spring. I know how many plants go in the ground. I know exactly how much I harvest. And I also keep track of everything that I store, freeze, or can. Because at the end of this season, next spring, if I have 6 Chinese cabbages in my storage cellar that I didn't eat this winter, I'm going to put less Chinese cabbage in the storage cellar next year. Or I'm going to make a promise to myself that I'm going to eat more in the winter. But oftentimes what I don't actually use means I'm not going to use it. So knowing that can really help you plan. For instance, a couple of years ago, I had a really, really big peach harvest, and I canned lots and lots of peaches. But then we had the year with the drought and all the squirrels, and I didn't have any peaches. But I had plenty of extra from the year before, so it all worked out, and I knew that I would eat those peaches. before I had another big crop. Always date everything before you store it in any way, because things do expire even when we put them up ourselves. And it's really good when you're going through whatever, your freezer or your shelf of canned goods, to say, oh, this is 3 years old. Maybe it's not as good as it was 3 years ago, and I won't use that this year. I also encourage you to be flexible and to use good, safe food handling guidelines. For instance, every book on canning and preserving and doing anything says, use fresh stuff, do it right away, pick it and process it all in one day. Well, you know what it's like today. We're all here in Maine. It's a really hot one, just like yesterday and the day before. Now, I'm picking maybe a gallon of blueberries every day or every other day. I'm not doing anything with blueberries in this weather. They're just going in the freezer. When I want to make pies or blueberry jam or whatever, I'll do that on a better day. And they'll be fine in the freezer for those purposes. You can also think about doing things in a transition way. Putting things in your basement that you're going to use in a couple of weeks to make stews or soups that you're going to freeze. You don't have to be all that fussy with them. They'll be fine for a couple of weeks, but you're not going to store them for 6 months. You can also use a technique like dehydrating. When something that you've stored is starting to be not as good as you'd like it to be, you can quickly dehydrate it and use it for other purposes. For instance, in the spring, I oftentimes dehydrate garlic and onions that are just not as crisp as I'd like them to be. I dehydrate them. I can then put them in soups or stews and they will rehydrate, or I can grind them up in a coffee mill and make my own garlic or onion powder. And so I use that produce in a good way. So to reiterate, the 5 options I'm going to talk about are cold storage, fermentation, dehydration, freezing, and canning. And I'm doing them in that order because for me, that's the easiest to the hardest. And for each of these, I'm going to talk about the advantages as I see them, the disadvantages as I see them, and the tools that will make this job easier for you. Before I go into any of that, though, I want to just take a pause and take a look at the really big picture. Because what we're doing when we're preserving food is we're basically asking a fruit or a vegetable to pause. We're saying, take a time out. You're perfectly ripe right now, and we want you to stop. We want to keep you just as you are for as long as possible so I can eat you when it suits my purposes. And they don't really want to do this. They want to mature and either as a fruit have something else eat them and scatter their seeds, or for something like a carrot, that big fleshy wonderful part of carrot that we want, well, that's what the carrot's going to use to make a new set of stalks next year and to form seed, because it's a biennial seed producer. So, the carrot isn't wanting us to eat it. It's actually wanting to stay in the ground all winter and then grow again in the spring. So our job is to figure out what it is going to take to get them to just stop so we can enjoy them. So the first thing I want to talk about is cold storage. Now, the advantages I see to cold storage is there's virtually no investment in equipment. One can use a cardboard box, plastic crates, wooden boxes, just about anything you have in your home, you can use for cold storage. And frankly, it takes very little time and effort to do this. The disadvantages as I see them, well, the freshness and the quality of the produce is going to decline over time. That's just what you put in the root cellar or your basement in November is not going to be exactly the same quality by March or April. And the other disadvantage is you need to find the right place in your house to do this. Another part of the work that I'll come back and talk about is, and you need to prepare the vegetables for storing. I call that curing. They need to, in a way that's important. So places in your house where you can probably store food right now. Do you have a cold bedroom or a closet in a bedroom that tends to be 50, 55 degrees? Great place to store winter squash. They'll store for 3 to 5 months at 50 to 55 degrees, and you don't really have to do much except go in every once in a while, make sure they're okay, and eat a couple. Your basement floor with nothing else. That's where I store my onions. I grow 50, 70 pounds of onions a year. I store them in crates on the basement floor. My basement stays about 50 degrees most of the winter, and they're just fine. Can't store squash in the basement because squash wants to be dry. Basements tend to be moist. If you have a cold corner in your basement, or you have a bulkhead, which is what I use as a root cellar, then you can store a lot of other things. A cold corner or a cold room in the basement or a bulkhead needs to stay between about 33 and 40 degrees for your best storage. Now, it can slip for a day or two below freezing. None of these vegetables are high in sugar. They're not going to freeze overnight and be ruined. They can't stay a week frozen. So you need some way to regulate the temperature by opening a door or opening a window or something like that. But you can store potatoes in a box. They need to be dark, but they can just be in a box, and they need to be dry, and they'll store easily 6 months if it's a good storage potato. Carrots and beets, I store them in shredded leaves in a box. The leaves should be slightly moist, and they last 6 months without any problem. You can dig celery. I think celery is a much underappreciated crop. It's a lot hardier than people think it is. So I have a crop coming in now, and I'll have a crop coming in November. And you can dig the celery, put the roots in a box with some compost or some soil, put a plastic bag over the box. I usually store 6 or 8 of them, and they can go in a cold place in the cellar, and you can cook with them for a month or so, and maybe make stews to freeze, and you've used up your celery. Cabbages, both Chinese cabbage and regular cabbage, wrapping the heads in newspaper so that they don't lose as much moisture, harvesting them with the roots on, again, sticking the roots in a box or on the floor, buried in compost or soil, keeping that soil modestly damp. They'll store all winter also. Another thing that we can store in Maine is apples. They should be in 1 layer in a box. I always have more, and I don't adhere to that 1 layer part. But apples cannot be stored with any of the other things that I've mentioned. Apples will give off a gas, and that gas will encourage those other root crops not to hibernate the way we want them to. I'm not going to talk about my bulkhead as a root cellar because in your bibliography, we wrote an article for the MOFGA paper about that talks all about how it's organized, how to build one, what to do. So I'm not going to go over that again because you can access that material on your own. So getting started for storing things, and this applies to mostly everything we're going to do today. Use only good quality produce. If you've got some yucky potatoes and some good potatoes, store the good ones, use the yucky ones first. Grow varieties that are known to be good storage varieties. That may not be something you were even thinking about this year, but next year, as you're looking through your seed catalogs and making decisions, most seed catalogs will tell you if it's a good storer or not. Many things need to be what I call cured before storing. They need to understand that they're no longer growing and that they need to hibernate. Usually that means cooling them off and drying them out a little bit. So onions, we shouldn't put onions into storage until their tops are totally dry. Usually by the end of August, your onion tops will start to fold over. I tend to then fold them all over in the row and leave them out there as long as the weather is conducive to drying. But if we get like a really wet September where it's raining a lot, I'll harvest them. I put them on racks or trays in the garage. On a nice day, I take them outside in the shade to dry. And then on the rainy days, they stay in the garage where there's some pretty good air circulation. Do the same thing with garlic. Potatoes. I don't wash off the dirt off my potatoes when I harvest them because I think that makes them too damp, but I do brush them off so they're reasonably clean. And again, I'm going to pack them in a box and put them in the garage where they're cool and dry and let their skin start to harden up a little bit. We'll do some of that in the ground after the tops dry down, but oftentimes it's not quite cold enough for me to move them into the basement. And the basement is damp, and I don't want to encourage any fungus to grow on them. So I want them nice and dormant and dry before I put them in the basement. Squash also needs to stabilize before you put it in that closet. I tend to put mine on the floor of the greenhouse in the shade. I can also put them in the garage. If it's a very wet fall, I oftentimes will wipe them down with a little water Clorox mix before I store them, just in case there's some fungus that is living on that skin. I don't want to encourage it to grow. Beets and carrots, I wash these and I pack them in shredded leaves. Why do I use shredded leaves? Well, they hold water nicely. They don't get too wet. They dry out slowly over time, and I have shredded leaves. I shred leaves in the fall to use for mulch and to use in the compost pile, so I'm using something that I already have. Some years I have to harvest excuse me, carrots and beets kind of early because they're ready, but it's not really cold enough to put them in what I use as a root cellar, so I'll stick them in a spare refrigerator until it's time to pack them up. Most of the times, and certainly with these extended falls that we've been having, I used to be putting my carrots and beets in the root cellar, say at the end of October, and now I'm tending to do that around Thanksgiving time, so that's really weird. Of course, last year I kind of got caught because I had to rush around because it suddenly got really cold really fast, and that can happen too. But that's the basics about cold storage. Very simple, very straightforward. If there's questions that should be answered now, I'm just going to assume that Hillary's going to butt in. And if there's not, I'm going to move on to fermentation.
Yep, no questions yet, June.
Okay, so either I'm totally losing people or I'm clear. I don't know, but we'll find out eventually.
Oh, one just came in, if you don't mind. One person is asking how you store leeks, or if you do store those.
I haven't had great luck storing leeks, but I have stored leeks standing up in a crate in the root cellar toward the bottom of the shelving. And I have found that they have lasted January, early February. It's just something that I haven't had a great deal of success with, and I have such a better success with onions that I've kind of moved away from leeks. It's not something I use a lot in my cooking. So I didn't figure out how to store them well, and I don't use them a lot. So I can't be really helpful on that. Any question that I can't be helpful with, you can always try any of the books and the resources, or try Extension. They really know a lot about this also.
And June, we have gotten a couple other questions in.
Sure.
One person just trying to figure out how damp is too damp for a basement.
Well, I'd say standing water is too damp, but generally, a damp basement is, it's fine. It's what we want. The carrots and the beets and the potatoes to stay hydrated. And we don't want them to get really cold, because if they get really cold, that will trigger them into thinking, oh, well, next time it warms up, I should use all this sugar that I've stored to start making sprouts and growing. So we want to keep them in that really sweet place. I consider my basement to be reasonably on the dry side, and that's why I water things, not the potatoes, but I water everything else in my root cellar about once a month. And you don't have a lot to lose. You store things in the cellar. If they rot, your cellar's too wet, you've learned something, and you'll figure out something else to do the next year. But you haven't made a big investment, you haven't spent a lot of money, you haven't taken a lot of time doing something. That may not be the most helpful answer, but some of this is figuring out what will work in your location.
Thanks, that's great. We actually have a couple other follow-up questions that I'll try to sneak in before you move on. One person wondering about that mix that you wipe your squash with. Was that water and vinegar, water and Clorox? And what was the ratio?
I have no idea what the ratio would be. I would take a small pan of a bucket of water and put a dollop of Clorox in. So a very light mixture, and just put it on a rag and just wipe it over the squash. And if you've tried to score squash before and it's got rotty points on it, that will really help. I haven't tried vinegar. I don't know if that would work or not, but bleach is a very good thing to kill fungus. So that's what I have used in the past.
Great. And then we'll ask one more now and save the rest to the end. Do you know what temperature your root cellar and or garage typically would be?
Actually, I do. I don't know as much about the garage. The garage kind of goes up and down with the daylight and nighttime, but it's, it's a 2-car garage. It faces south. It has windows that I leave open until it goes below freezing. So my guess is it ranges between 40 and 60 degrees throughout the fall when I would have things in there. In my cellar and my root cellar, one of the wonderful things if you're doing this is to get those remote temperature things. So right here in my kitchen, I have a remote temperature thing, and then I stick the other receiver or broadcaster in the root cellar, and I can be having my morning coffee and know that the root cellar is 34 degrees or 37 degrees. And if I see that it's 31 degrees, I go downstairs and crack the door open, and in an hour it's 33 degrees. So that's the easiest way to monitor. My bulkhead stays between 33 and 39 degrees from mid-November until mid-March, if that's helpful.
Thank you, June. I think I'll hold the rest of the questions for now to let you get through all of this material.
Okay, so fermentation. The advantage is it's easy, and it really doesn't require a lot of equipment or know-how. The disadvantages, as I see them, is not everything ferments well. And it's very difficult, I think, to do fermentation if you're limiting salt in your diet. And not everybody likes the end product. And once fermented, the end product should at least stay cold to stop or really retard, slow down the fermentation process, which means, I make sauerkraut and I store it in the refrigerator when it's done. The most common things that are fermented are sauerkraut, kimchi, half-sour pickles, but there's wonderful books on fermentation. Sandor Katz was a speaker at the fair a number of years ago. Has a great book on how to ferment just about anything. And the basic technique is you make a brine according to a recipe, which is water and salt. You chop up the vegetables as instructed, and you pack them tightly in a container. You cover them with the brine, and then you put them in a cold place to work. The equipment that you need, you can have anything from a very fancy crock. I have a really big crock, which I didn't get out to show people because it's really heavy, but it has nice heavy stones that sit in the top of it. The reason you want something on top of what's fermenting is you always want the vegetable to be underneath the brine. But you can use anything to ferment in, and one of the most easy things is a food-grade plastic bucket. Now that isn't the plastic bucket that your spackling came in, that's food grade. And you can buy one of those for probably under $10, although I don't recall, at any place that sells brewing equipment. But here where I live, I go down to Hannaford, I go to the bakery and say, hey, do you have any of those big buckets that you get icing in for your cakes? And they always have a couple of those kicking around that they're just going to send to recycling or maybe throw out. I don't know quite what they do with it. And they're very happy to give you one or two. So you don't really need to spend any money to do this. The easiest way to keep your brine above your vegetables is after you pack it, you put a big plate on top of the vegetables. You fill a canning jar with water and you use that to weight the plate down so that the brine is above the vegetables. Then when it's done, you want it to stop digesting and have some show and tell here. One of the things I quite like is these jars with the rubber seals on the top, because they will kind of burp as it keeps working. I pack my sauerkraut in this and then stick it in the refrigerator. Another thing one can use once you pack it in a jar, this is called a pickle egg. And it's just a round disc of glass that fits nicely into a canning jar or into those jars. And it just weights things down so that the brine stays above the product. If the brine goes below the product, then the product's going to mold and it's going to ruin your batch. That's all I've got on fermenting. I don't do a lot of it. It's pretty straightforward. It either works or it doesn't. Here it usually works, but I've had some bad batches that have just gone in the compost for another day. So I'll pause for a moment in case there's questions about fermenting before I move on.
Thanks, June. I'm not seeing any questions about fermentation in there yet. Yeah, so I think you could move on. I have one question that we'll keep to the end because it's not explicitly about fermentation.
Okay, the third technique I wanted to talk about is drying or dehydrating. And again, the same sort of modality. The advantages, this is really easy. And the end product stores indefinitely in any airtight container. The end product doesn't take up much space. And dried foods, nothing happens to dried foods if the power goes out. It's kind of the same thing with nothing happens to the stuff stored in your basement. If you lose power for 4 or 5 days, they don't really care. The disadvantages of dehydration. Even a cheap dehydrator will cost you, under $100, but that's an outlay if you're not sure that you're going to really use this stuff. I use a temperature-controlled, large-size dehydrator that has a good fan and a timer. And I've had this for quite a long time, and I think it cost around $500. So that's a big investment. But I started with a small, cheap one that is more work because you have to futz around with it more, but realized that I really liked dehydrating and I was really going to use this stuff. So that was great. Another disadvantage, as I see it, is that you do need electricity to dehydrate in this climate. I don't know anything about solar dehydrators, but most of the things I dehydrate, they dehydrate at a temperature of about 135, 140, 125, and they're done in about 24 hours or so. But that's constant, steady, dry heat with a fan. I don't know how it would work to have things outside during a day like today and then have that process stop overnight and then start again the next day. And I don't know anything about dehydrating in ovens. That's never felt to me to be a good use of fossil fuels, but I just don't know anything about it because I've never done it. I want to show you the size of the dehydration trays. This is what comes with my dehydrator. There's 9 of these trays, and they come with this wonderful fine plastic mesh, so most things will not fall through from one level to the other. And they also come with an optional sheet. And I use this to make things like fruit leather, and one of my favorites is tomato. I make tomato sauce and then dehydrate it, and I use that instead of tomato paste in the winter. To thicken up things that I'm making with canned tomatoes, which tend to be more watery than store-bought tomatoes. If one were going to dehydrate, I would suggest getting a good book on it and just following the instructions. Most things, you just chop it up and put it in the dehydrator, turn it on, set the timer, and then pack it in jars. I use canning jars for storage. Let me show you something else. Last year was a good apple year. This is a half gallon of dried apples. That's probably 30 or 40 apples in that half gallon. I dried 3 gallons of apples, and I toss them in oatmeal when I'm making oatmeal in the winter. I make pies out of them. And this year, I don't know where you are, but this year's not going to be a good apple year. We had 2 frosts while the blossoms were setting. And so I'm very happy to have plenty of leftover dehydrated apples, which will be good this year, next year, and as far as I'm concerned, 5 years from now. I dehydrate just about anything that I can. I just enjoy playing with it. So the things I dehydrate are garlic, onions, herbs, apples, elderberries, mushrooms, tomatoes. Love small tomatoes dehydrated, like sun-dried tomatoes. Carrots, green beans, asparagus, zucchini. The tomato leather that I talked about. I dehydrate. I have prune plums in my orchard, so I make prunes. I have seedless grapes, so I make raisins. I dehydrate peaches, apples, and I also make some fruit leather from time to time. That's it. It's a pretty straightforward process. All you need is a dehydrator and the ability to chop things up small.
Thanks, June. We have a couple questions on dehydrating. Linda's wondering if you need to use a desiccant when you're storing the dehydrated foods to keep them dry.
Well, I don't. I don't know what I would use as a desiccant that I would want around my food, but I don't know much about them. That's why I store them in canning jars, because they're airtight. Once they're, you pack them to the top. I store them upstairs in the pantry. I've never had any issue with dried stuff storing well at all. Usually the book that I use gives you a pretty good test of this should be dry when it bends, or this should be dry when it's brittle. And I just do what it says, and I haven't had any problems. So no, that's why I said this is very easy. You don't need anything else. You just need something to put them in that's airtight. Ziploc bags probably would work, although I prefer to use canning jars.
Question about drying apples. Can you use drop apples, or do you use just fresh picked ones yourself?
I'd use drops. Here, I have a small orchard, and I tend to use drops and make juice. But as long as you're cutting out, you're going to have to core the apples and slice them. So it's very easy to cut out the bad parts. And, I would obviously wash drops before I use them, but I think drops make great dried apples. I oftentimes will dry the apples I dry a particular variety because it comes in early and it doesn't store. But I dry things that, aren't going to be attractive in a sauce or in something else, because you can fiddle around with it. You're making little pieces.
Great. One more question we have from Donna. Do you have to change the location of the trays from top to bottom when you're processing? Do the trays process at the same time?
In the Excalibur dehydrator that I have, those 9 trays really work together at the same time. In the more inexpensive ones, which usually have a blower at the bottom and you stack the trays on top of each other, then oftentimes during the drying period, you do need to switch the trays around because the stuff on the bottom will dry faster. But the Excalibur is set up so the fan is in the back of the unit and is blowing against all the trays uniformly. Every once in a while, if it's something really juicy, I might take the top and the bottom tray halfway through and put them in the middle and put the middle trays on the top and the bottom. But usually I don't do anything with it.
That's great. And then we have a couple of questions sort of about how you like to use dehydrated food. One is specifically, do you ever dehydrate green tomatoes? And if so, what you might use them for? And then we just had a general question about other recommendations you might make for using dehydrated food.
Okay. I don't cook with green tomatoes. I will tell you that what I do with my green tomatoes is I make Nova Scotia chow chow, which is a relish of green tomatoes and onions. And that takes like 10 pounds of onions and 40 pounds of green tomatoes. So that usually uses up pretty much what I have. If I had recipes where drying green tomatoes would be something I would use, perhaps, but that's not within my experience. The way we use dried things in this house is for instance, when I'm making a tomato sauce or making something with tomatoes, I might throw in a handful of dried tomatoes to simmer with that, to give it some meatier texture. I throw the carrots or the green beans or the asparagus or onions in soups and stews all the time, just to enrich the flavor. Especially helpful as it's coming closer to spring and maybe I'm running out of some things that are in storage. Same with dried mushrooms. I get a good deal on a bunch of mushrooms. I might dry them and then use those all winter to enrich stews and soups. The dried elderberries I make into a syrup. Any of the dried fruits can be rehydrated and made into pies or cakes. Frankly, dehydrated is just the kind of resting that they're doing is we're taking away all your water so you can't do anything. And if we want you to be food again, we put the water back in. The last thing that I do with, sometimes I dry cress and herbs and celery, and I would grind them up in a coffee mill and add salt to them and make sort of a homemade version of like an herbamari, kind of an herb salt that can be used to flavor things. I think that's pretty much what I use stuff for.
That sounds great. I'm going to hold one or two other questions toward the end.
Okay, so moving along, freezing. Now I think freezing is probably the most popular way of preserving foods. And its advantages are you get very good quality. It's probably the closest you're going to get to fresh. And it stores usually very well for a year or even more. It's relatively easy to freeze. And the workload is pretty low to moderate. It's a little more work than dehydrating, but it's not as much work as canning. The only disadvantage that I can see to freezing is you need a freezer. And you're dependent on electricity. There's nothing worse than having a 12 cubic foot freezer full of all your harvest and then have the electricity go out for 5 days, unless you have a way to supplement your power. I heard this hint, and people may know it, but I didn't know it, so I thought it was really good. In your freezer, the hint was take an ice cube and put it in a plastic bag, put it somewhere in the freezer where you can see it. If the power is gone out, usually your freezer is good for 24 to 48 hours, particularly if it's pretty full. And then after that, things are going to start to defrost. If when the power goes back on, if you still have an ice cube in that bag, you're good. If that ice cube has melted into a puddle of water, then you have problems with what you've stored. So I thought that was a really good hint, because sometimes, the power's out and you're not quite sure, is it good, is it not good? If the ice cube isn't melted, you're good. One of the big decisions about freezing is containers. Most of the books that I've read recommend against glass. Sort of glass and freezing kind of seems, kind of perilous. And if you're going to use glass, you need to use a tempered glass, like a Pyrex, something like you could put in the freezer and then put in the oven. But frankly, I can't afford to buy that many containers of glass. And although I am personally loath to use a lot of plastic, I think you're pretty much stuck with using plastic when you're freezing. So I'll show you a couple of things. More than 20 years ago, I bought a big supply of pints and quart plastic containers that all take the same lid. And I use them over and over and over again. I've used them for over 20 years. They're as good today as they were when I bought them, and I suspect I'll use them till I die. So I am using plastic, but I am using and reusing and reusing. And I love them. They stack well in the freezer. They're easy to label. I think they're a really good option. Another option you have is vacuum sealed bags. You buy these little gadgets and you buy plastic bags and you put the bag in the gadget and it sucks all the air out of it and seals it. Frankly, you're going to get your best quality product that way because there's no air around the product and it's going to stay as fresh as possible. The downside is you're going to throw away that plastic bag every time you use something out of the freezer. There are also plastic coated cardboard boxes, kind of like what you buy frozen vegetables in the grocery store. You can buy those boxes and that's another option. I've played around with them. I think they're satisfactory. And if you really want to stay away from plastic, obviously they're coated with plastic, but they work pretty well. And I've reused them a couple of times until they kind of don't hold up very well. The big thing with freezing is most stuff has to be processed before you freeze it, but not everything. So the things that you don't need to process, berries. I just wash them and freeze them for later use, as I talked about before. Most other fruits you can just freeze, but some of them need to be peeled, like peaches, or pitted, but you don't really have to do a lot to them. And the one vegetable that I freeze and everybody else I know freezes without any preparation is peppers. And I don't know why peppers hold up so well freezing, but they do. Just chopping them up and freezing them, they seem fine. Whether you're going to use them uncooked or cooked, they seem okay, and I can't really explain that. But in general, what we want to do in freezing is we want to blanch the vegetable for a very short period of time to stop the enzyme, that's not a word I say well, action. We want to, again, put these vegetables in hibernation, suspended animation while they're in the freezer. We don't want anything going on that's going to decrease their quality. And once they're blanched, they need to be plunged right into cold water because you don't want to cook them. You're just wanting to kill the enzyme action. And then after cold water, draining and packing. The time for blanching varies by vegetable. I use a cookbook. I use Joy of Cooking to figure that out, but other books will have that. But usually blanching time is between 2 and 4 minutes. Now, I think there's some things that are helpful to you, and I notice we're running out of time, but let me just show you a couple of things. This is a big pot that I use for blanching. It's large. It has a good lid. It needs to be filled with water. And in that pot fits this colander. I didn't buy these together, but I found the colander and then I found a pot that fitted it. So I can pack the colander with, 2 heads of broccoli chopped up, plunge it into the hot water. When my 4 minutes is up, I can pull it out immediately and dump it into the cold water. So that just makes it easier than trying to fish things out of a pot of boiling water. Another option you have with blanching is steam blanching, which uses less water, but you have to do it in smaller quantities. And I use a double boiler, which is just, a top thing with holes in the bottom and a bottom pan that you put a couple of inches of water in. And again, it makes it easy. When the blanching's over, I can just take the top pan, dump it into the cold water in the sink, and then move on. Having good equipment like that really moves the process along, especially if you're dealing with hot boiling things. Moving quickly, processing carefully always helps you with the quality of what you're doing. Another thing that I do is I freeze everything that I can on cookie sheets because I might not want to use a whole quart of broccoli in something. I might want to use half of it in a stir fry. Peas, I freeze them on a cookie sheet and then pack them in pints. And they're loose like marbles. So I can cook a whole pint of peas if that's what I want, or I can take a cup of that out and add it to a recipe. I think freezing on cookie sheets freezes things really quickly and gives you a better quality product than packing them in the container and then having your freezer slowly freeze everything from the outside toward the middle. I happen to have a freezer upstairs here in the refrigerator right next to me that works really well. I have a system where I prop up cookie sheets and I can slide 3 or 4 in them at a time and things freeze in like 2 hours or so. So that's really quick. I was going to talk about the way I freeze broccoli, but I'm seeing that we're kind of close on time, so maybe I'll come back to that in the Q&A. The reason I was going to talk about it, I'll just say briefly, I started gardening before there was high tunnels. I didn't know about remay. I didn't have a greenhouse. So basically we grew what we were going to eat all year. We grew it in the summer and had to preserve it. You know, today the growing season is being stretched out just by climate change, but it's also being stretched out by things like high tunnels and other techniques that let us garden for a longer time in the soil and many. So oftentimes when I'm freezing, I'm freezing a crop of broccoli. So I'm going to freeze 25 heads when I pick broccoli, and then 3 or 4 days later, I'm going to freeze another 25 heads. And I was going to talk about how I manage those big quantities, but I think I'll set that aside for a moment so we have some time to talk about canning, and then we can come back to questions. I don't want to run out of time and run over, but I'm happy to hang around as long as we want for questions. So canning, I've left the most complicated to last, but there are advantages to canning. First of all, the equipment is reasonably inexpensive and it lasts indefinitely. Secondly, when properly canned, things store well for a year or 2 or 3. I think the books say you should use it in a year. I'm comfortable with 2 years. I've never had any spoilage or anything amiss. And you know, all of that storage happens without electricity. Once things are canned, you don't have to worry that something else is going to happen that's going to ruin it. There's some minor disadvantages. One is, you know, first of all, you have to buy jars and fans and lids, and then you have to buy new lids every year. The absolutely essential piece of canning is you need to use new lids every year. You should not reuse your lids. Another disadvantage that I see is it's hot work. You're dealing with a big pan of boiling water, and things really have to be clean if you're not going to have some spoilage problems with your finished product. And in fact, in some cases, that not only can the product spoil, but if you're pressure canning, the product can actually also be poisonous. Not that that's ever happened to me. So I want to talk a little bit about water bath canning, because that's, I think, what people do the most. Use that for jams, jellies, pickled products, fruits. Personally, I prefer to can peaches than to freeze peaches. I just think it's a better product. Similarly, I prefer to can tomatoes rather than freeze tomatoes because I just think it's a better product, although freezing tomatoes is easier. Basically, you can water bath can anything that is acid in and of itself, like a tomato, or anything to which you add a lot of acid, like pickles with a lot of vinegar. Oftentimes there's a question about mixtures such as something like salsa, which would have non-acid vegetables in it, like onions and peppers. My understanding of best practices is things like that need to be pressure canned. And so I have never played around with not doing that. And so I don't have any real expertise there. My understanding is when you mix things together, you process it for the most amount of time required by the vegetable that is the fussiest. So I'm going to stop with that. First of all, I want to remind people, if you've never done this, because I had a friend who canned a whole bunch of tomatoes and didn't realize something. And that is, the pot you're going to can in is really big. It has to be big enough so that there's 2 inches of water on top of the jar and then room for that water to boil. So you're not going to be canning in the pot that you make pasta in because you're not going to have that water covering your jars. In addition, the other couple of things that you need is you need a rack that goes in the bottom of the can so the jars do not sit on the bottom of the pot or they'll break. And if you're canning and something breaks, everything needs to be thrown out. Part of what happens is canning is things expand, pushing the air out of the jar, and then when you take it out of the water, things contract and the jar seals. If you have broken glass in that water anywhere, then there is no way you can guarantee that glass has not gotten into any of your product, even in the unbroken jar. So you don't really want to break a jar. Then, the other thing thing I think you need is you need a jar lifter. You need something to put the jars in the big pot of boiling water and something to take them out. I also wear rubber gloves when I can. And the key word for canning is sterilize. Usually the instructions are you want to prepare whatever you're canning that day. You want start to finish all in one big session. And that can be really hard to do, especially if you want to be canning a lot. And I can talk about some of the ways that I circumvent that, but I'm going to just move on to more of the basics and we can come back to that. So whatever you're canning needs to be close to or at boiling when you pack it in the jars. The canning kettle itself needs to be boiling or very close to boiling when you start packing the jars. And a canning kettle that size, I have a gas stove, that can take 40 minutes to reach a boiling point. So working ahead is really important. And your jars need to be sterilized, your lids need to be sterilized, and your bands at least need to be washed. I will tell you something that I do around sterilization. I don't have a dishwasher. I have had them in the past, and oftentimes they'll have a cycle where you can put the jars in there, wash them, and hold them hot, which works really, really nicely, but I don't have that. So what I do after I wash my jars, I have them all filled with hot water, as hot as comes from my tap, and they're sitting in one side of the sink. When I get ready to can, I take one of the jars, dump out that water that's maybe 120 or 130 degrees. I use my jar lifter, I put it into the canning kettle and fill it with boiling water. And then I set that in the sink. And then I set up an assembly line. So that's my hot jar. So I take a jar that's going to be jar number 2, pour out the less hot water, pour the boiling water into jar number 2, and then I pack jar number 1 when it's very, very hot with my hot material, do what one does to seal the jars, put that jar in the canning bath, and then again do the same thing. And that way I have a very nice hot jar to put my material in, and that also decreases it certainly decreases the problem of having anything that might spoil the product, but also keeps things at a similar temperature so jars don't crack. Average canning times range from 10 minutes to as long as 30 or 40 minutes. And the time starts when that big kettle comes back to boiling. As you're adding the product in, that kettle is going to start cooling down even if you've got a good flame under it. So you have to wait for that is backed up to a rolling boil again, and then you start timing your canning. And I would advise always using a timer. A kettle holds 7 jars at a time, pints or quarts. So canning can oftentimes, if you have a lot of product, can be a long, hot day. The other thing that I can in a water bath canner is fruit juices. I like to make a lot of juice. That's a thing that I use drops for, or imperfect fruit. I just juice them. And that's one of the easiest things I find to can, because it's just easier to deal with liquids, and the canning time is usually quite short. And some juices you could even just pasteurize by holding the canning kettle at about 190 degrees. So that just makes it a little bit easier. So the last thing I'm going to just mention in the few minutes that we have left before we move on to questions is pressure canning. And I've saved that for last because I think it's used the least these days. Now, the advantage of pressure canning is it can be used on any non-acid foods and on mixtures of foods. And it uses a lot less water because you only have a tiny bit of, an inch or 2 of water in the bottom of the pressure canner. And the work is a lot less hot. The disadvantages are, again, sterilization and correct processing times are really very, very important. And if done incorrectly, that environment, because it is an acid, can harbor a toxin called botulism, which is both odorless and tasteless. So if that's there, you don't know it. Consequently, the usual advice in canning books is if you're canning peas, green beans, corn, that before you use them, you boil them for 10 minutes. For me, that's a lot of cooking and leaching of uh, vitamins and minerals that I would prefer to freeze. But it is a technique, and it is also available if one wants to do it. And I am seeing, my clock says it's 3 minutes to 6. So I think I will stop there and take questions. And if people have questions about things I've skipped, I will then talk about them. And if you don't, well, then I'll save them for another time.
Thanks so much, June. We do have some questions. Maybe I'll start with the ones related to canning and then move back from there.
Sounds like a good idea.
Okay. One person just asked what you mean by band. That was 2 minutes ago.
So these are canning lids. They go on the top of the jar. This is, I'm trying to figure out how to make this show up here. This is a canning band. It screws on the top of the jar and holds the lid on tight while it is canning. You don't ever have to rebuy the band. You get a set of lids and bands when you purchase your jars, and then you can reuse the jars indefinitely, reuse the bands indefinitely, but you have to keep rebuying lids.
Perfect. And somebody is asking, do you need to boil the new lids for sterilization?
I would think what I do, I put the lids, just when I'm going to use them, I put them in a pot and I pour boiling water over them and just let them sit in the boiling water. I don't actually bring the pot to a boil, although I think I used to do that. So I may have become a little slack in my technique, but I haven't had any problem with that. But certainly they should be exposed to boiling water in some way before they're used.
Great. And Suzanne is asking, have you had any luck keeping jars in the oven at the lowest temp for her 170 degrees, I guess, for sterilization?
I have never thought of doing that. Frankly, on a day when I'm canning, having another hot thing in the kitchen really doesn't appeal to me. But I don't know. And if I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work. I don't know if you'd have them dry or have water in them, but I mean, the idea is to have them very clean and hot. And so however one accomplishes that, I'd say, you know, give it a try. I wouldn't do it on everything I canned and then find out that it actually wasn't good enough. But I think if you took them out of the oven at 170 degrees and then poured boiling water in them and then poured it back out before you packed them, I think that would be probably good if they had been cleaned, yeah.
Okay, great. One person is wondering what brand of pressure canner you use and what you like to pressure can.
Oh boy, I almost brought the pressure canner up from the basement, but I didn't. I mean, I'm going to assume it's a Presto because that's what I used to use. I don't know what's down there right now. When I didn't have electricity, I pressure can just about everything: peas, corn, green beans. Even tried pressure canning some zucchini because that really grows. And I never had any problem with it. But the product itself it's mushy. You know, once you boil it to make sure you're safe, you've got a pretty mushy, well-cooked product. I can't think of anything else. I mean, I've canned carrots and beets sometimes at the end of the season because I had some really good ones and I wanted to, you know, keep them further into the year, and I didn't have any other way to do that without electricity. But it fell by the wayside once I, you know, had electricity and had other options. That just didn't seem to me to be the freshest option to use.
Thanks, yeah. Let's see, let's go to Linda's question, wondering about preserving herbs in vinegar or oil. Do you do that? Do you put them in the fridge? earlier on, we also had another question about herb vinegar and what type of vinegar you might use.
I don't do that. I use vinegar a lot in cleaning, but I'm not a big vinegar fan in my palate. I would assume that one would use a cider vinegar because that's what I see in every recipe that I've ever run across. Roberta Bailey might be a good person to ask or research that. She writes the kitchen column for the MOFGA paper, and she does everything. I will add a cautionary note about herbs in oil. Because oil is also will block out the air, and because herbs, there's a issue with herbs in oil and botulism, and obviously professional people know how to do that and not have that issue. But I've seen a number of warnings for us amateurs that may not be the safest way to do herbs. Depending on the moisture content and other things about the herb. So once I saw that warning, I just didn't pursue that. So I can't be of any more help than that.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a variety of comments that are all really interesting. Folks talking about pressure canners, someone mentioning that she freezes pesto, elderflower cordial in ice cubes, and then switches that to Ziplocs and uses portions as needed. And then taking a step back to the freezing section, we had various folks asking about blanching and freezing things like green beans and summer squash. Do you blanch both of those things and freeze them? Is sogginess ever an issue with blanching?
Done properly, sogginess should not be an issue. I freeze lots of green beans, and they're blanched for like 2 minutes. And one of the things that I do, I was going to talk about this about how I do 25 heads of broccoli, but when I do green beans, I'm going to blanch them whole because I don't want to cut things. The more I cut them, the more vitamins and nutrients are going to leak into the water. So I'm going to blanch them whole, cool them off, and then if I want to have them cut or Frenched or something like that for freezing, I'll do that after they're blanched. And I think that helps them hold their texture more because you're blanching, the whole bean rather than just little pieces of it. So that's a technique I use to not have things. Part of my preference, and going back to what will you eat and what will you actually use, I've had my fill of summer squash by September, and I don't do anything with it. I will dry some to throw in soups and stews, but I just don't want to do anything with summer squash after that point. I will oftentimes just pull my plants because I'm kind of done and wanting to move on to a different vegetable. But I don't see any reason why properly blanched, and I would assume that you would have to cube it in some way to blanch it. And yes, no, the texture is not going to be good. Summer squash is watery. Very watery things don't freeze as well. Asparagus doesn't freeze particularly well. You lose all the texture. But making that asparagus, freezing some and then making it into a soup later, or using it in quiche seems to work just fine. And I would assume the texture on the squash isn't going to be so good, but that depends on what you're going to use it in. So being creative in your use might help you use that, throughout the winter in a different way.
Yeah, thank you. On the topic of blanching, one person asked whether you would use a salad spinner to remove water after blanching.
Actually, I do. I put a colander in the sink of cold water, and that has to actually be changed pretty frequently because it will warm up from the vegetables pretty quickly. Then I dump that into another colander to drain a little bit on the other side of the sink. Then I dump it into a salad spinner and I spin it, and then I put it on the tray. Or sometimes if I really want it dry, then I put it on a towel and let it drain just a little bit more. Obviously, the drier it is, the easier the pieces are going to be separate pieces to freeze. And They don't really stick to the cookie tray because the minute you take it out of the freezer, the tray starts to warm up and everything pops off. But it is nice to have a good dry product, and I'm sorry that I did not mention that.
That's great. A few more questions coming in on this topic. First, do you like to store broccoli whole if you're freezing it? And to give you a second question as a follow-up, do you like to freeze greens, and do you blanch those before freezing?
Okay, let me do the greens one first, then I'll talk a little bit about broccoli. Yes, I do freeze greens. For my palate, I really want to eat spinach in February and March. I eat it when it grows, but I really crave it at that time of year. So I freeze a lot of spinach, and yes, I blanch it. I blanch it, spin it, and then I chop it and pack it in pint containers. And I think it's very good. I use that all winter long. With broccoli, what I do is to blanch it, I take the head of broccoli and I cut it lengthwise so that I maybe have 2 stalks and a head, on each piece. So I try to leave it pretty big, but not so big that it doesn't get well blanched. So, the stalk, you have the big center stalk, and then as each stalk comes up to the head, I try to have things not much bigger than one of those stalks. Then after it's blanched, I might chop it up more finely so it fits better into a container. I think in general, most instructions about blanching do want you to have things to be a uniform size. If you stuck a whole head of broccoli in and blanched, I don't think the timing would be right for the stalk versus the top. And boy, I think for my broccoli, you need a much bigger pot than I want to use.
That's great. I just want to mention, June, that folks are starting to leave, and a lot of folks are thanking you for this great presentation. We do have some other questions. Let's see. I'm going to go to a few that we had from earlier on first. One person wondering about steam blanching versus regular blanching. Are the times different for those methods?
Yes, they're not significantly different, but they are different. Steam blanching tends to be 30 seconds to a minute longer for the same vegetable, and you have to do much smaller batches so that the steam can reach everything. On the other hand, you're not dealing with a big pot of boiling water. And so for me, for like peas, I'd rather steam blanch 20 batches of peas than to put all those little peas into a big thing and then dump them all into the sink. It's easier for me to work in smaller quantities. So steam blanching is a little longer, but it's really not appreciably longer. For broccoli, it might be 3.5 minutes for water bath blanching and 4 or 4.5 minutes for steaming. So it's not a big deal.
Great. And then I think 2 more questions here about freezing. You mentioned that you need to blanch to stop the enzyme action. What does happen if you don't blanch the vegetables?
My assumption, since I've always blanched, my assumption is that eventually they're not as asleep, they're not in suspended animation as much as they need to be, so that your texture may be a little less good. It may pick up more of the freezer flavor. I'm not really sure, but my sense is that what we're trying to do is to get the biological action to stop. And when you think about it, when something comes in from the garden, it's warm and it's growing. And what we wanted to do is to do something totally different. We want to say, no, you need to stop doing that. But we don't want you to deteriorate. We just want you to hold that freshness right there. And so anything that interferes with that, we need to do something about. So we either take all the water away, which makes most things not work, or we blanch to kill whatever microorganisms or little things that are on the skin or in the stalk that would keep a biological process going. That's the way I understand it. I'm not a scientist, and that's not the the strong part of my knowledge, but that's the way I understand it.
That's helpful, thanks. One question from David. He writes, would a light vinegar bath work for greens before freezing? Do we lose some nutrients by chopping greens before freezing?
I have no idea about a light vinegar bath. I don't think it would hurt anything. I don't chop my greens before I blanch them. I blanch them whole. I chop them afterwards, and I do that because it's easier for me to handle it on the other end. I'm not sure that much leaches out after things are frozen, not like they would when they're being blanched. So I'm not as particularly concerned about that, but there's no reason why you have to chop before you pack it. I mean, chopping usually just makes things pack easier, but I don't think it's required.
Thanks, June. A question from earlier on, what method of preserving produce would you recommend if folks are really concerned about preserving as much nutritional value as possible in the produce?
I would say freezing, followed up by dehydrating.
Okay, great.
But I also think cold storage, if done well, I think things are in very good shape, and they're really hibernating, and I don't think they lose a lot, but I don't know. I'm sure there's studies on that where people, however you measure that, people would know. But, you know, in cold storage, you're not chopping or heating or doing anything. You're just cooling things down and keeping them hibernating. So what could be lost?
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. One question has come in related to fermentation. Do you need to can or heat in any way the fermented product or put it in smaller jars once it's ready?
No and yes. So I don't can things like sauerkraut or can anything fermented, because part of the benefit of a fermented product is and I don't remember the name of it, but that the action of fermentation actually creates things that is good for you and good for your digestive tract. When you heat that up, then that kills that, and it obviously stops the process, but then you don't get that benefit. So I don't do that. But once it's done, it doesn't actually get done. It just keeps fermenting. And so sauerkraut just left on its own will eventually, the cabbage will lose all of its structure and just kind of become mush as the fermentation continues. And that's not very appealing. So when it's fermented and crisp and tasty, and however one likes one's sauerkraut, then packing it in other jars and keeping it cold, like in a refrigerator, then that keeps the fermentation action very, very low and preserves that quality of the freshness of the ferment. But certainly people cook sauerkraut, people can sauerkraut, but it's not what I want to use my fermented vegetables for, so I don't go down that road.
Thank you. And a couple of questions from the very beginning about root cellaring and storing. One person is wondering if you store any root vegetables right in the ground until you want to eat them.
No, because when I do that, I find that the mice have had a very good winter, and I haven't. I have yet to figure out how to keep things out of them. And with the uneven winters that we have, I mean, to do that successfully, I know people put bales of straw over a patch of carrots, and I don't have cats, and maybe that's my downfall, is I don't, but that just gives rodents, the perfect environment under the snow to just, hang out and feast all winter. But in doing that and keeping that pretty stable, and if you get a good blanket of snow and that stays there all winter, parsnips and carrots they're designed to be able to do that if you get to dig them at the right time. But I haven't had success with that, so I stopped trying. It just seemed like when they're in my cellar, I know they're safe and okay, and I don't tend to have mice in my cellar. But people do it, and people are successful with it. I think it might depend more on your ground and the kind of rodent pressure you may have on your property.
Absolutely. Well, I think I've gotten to most questions, if not all, and it's getting to be 6:20, so I think perhaps we should tie things up. Thanks so much, June. This was really wonderful, and we're getting lots of comments in the chat about people really appreciating what they've learned tonight.
Well, great. It was really my pleasure to do this, and thank you to MOFGA for making these resources available to people. I think it's really helpful to feel like you're part of a community and you have people you can turn to with questions and get information.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, June, and thanks to everyone for joining tonight. Like I mentioned earlier, it has been recorded, and I'll send out the recording to everyone who registered for the webinar over the next couple days. So good luck in your gardens this summer, and good luck with your food preservation adventures.